Hey guys, welcome to Coding in Flow. In this video we will learn how to start a foreground service in Android. You can imagine a service as an activity without a user interface. It can be started from another app component, like an activity or a broadcast receiver, and then it keeps running independently from the lifecycle of the component that started it. So for example, we start a service from an activity, we close this activity, and then the service keeps running and can do some work in the background, like network operations, location updates, or playing music, while the user is not actively interacting with the app. Now before Android Oreo, we could just keep these services running in the background invisibly and do our work there without the user ever noticing something from it. But of course, when 20 different apps do this at the same time, this will drain a lot of battery and slow down the phone. And for this reason we now have some limits to this since Android Oreo or API level 26, and in a nutshell we can't keep a background service running anymore when our app itself is in the background. Instead the system will just kill the service after a short time. But there are different ways to avoid this. One way is to use the job scheduler to do the background work instead, and I have a separate video on that which you can find when you click on the little eye in the top right corner of this video. Another option is to make the service a foreground service. Foreground services have these persistent notifications which you can't swipe off the screen. They are always there as long as the service is running. This way the user is aware of it and can see that your app is using up system resources. A good example for such a foreground service is a music player, for example. The player should keep playing music while the app itself is in the background, and the user is aware of it, so he should see this notification. These foreground services are also very unlikely to get killed by the system. In this video we will learn how to create such a foreground service and how to display this notification, but we won't do any actual work in there because this is very specific to your use case. Instead we will just create the service and keep it running like this. Now if you know my notifications video, then you also know that since Android Oreo we have to create notification channels in order to be able to show notifications. And this is also the case for foreground services. So we will start by creating a notification channel, but I won't explain everything in detail. Instead you can watch my separate notification channels video, which you will also find in the top right corner of this video. And the same as in our notification channels video, we create our channels in the application class. So we go into our Java folder, into our package, we right click on our package and create a new Java class. We simply call it app and it has to extend android.app.application. We don't change anything else and click OK. We create one constant, public static final string, channel underscore idea equals, and we give it an idea, example service channel, for example. Then we override on create, because in here we want to create our notification channel. We call create notification channel, and we create this method below our onCreate method here. Private void create notification channel. And again, if you want to know what exactly is happening here, you have to watch my notification channels video. The same as there we check if we are on Android Oreo, if build.version.sdkint is greater or equal to build.versioncodes.o. If we are on Oreo or higher, only then we want to create our notification channel. So we create a notification channel object, we simply call it service channel or whatever you want, equals new notification channel. I put the arguments into separate lines, the ID is our channel ID, we give it a name, example service channel, and we give it an importance level, notification manager dot importance. And for a foreground service, the notification importance has to be at least importance low. Here we're just gonna choose default. And down here we close it with a semicolon. Now we need a handle to the notification manager. We call it manager equals get system service notification manager.class. And then we call manager.create notification channel and pass our service channel. And now this channel will be created as soon as we start our app. Okay, nice. Next, let's register our app class in the manifest file. So we go into our manifest folder and open Android manifest.xml. Here in our application tag, we define Android name as our .app class. And that's already it. Now our app class will wrap our whole application, and its onCreate method will be called as soon as we start our app. Next, let's prepare our main activity layout, so we go into our activity main.xml file. We delete this text view here and change the constraint layout root layout into a linear layout, which we give the orientation vertical, a gravity of center, so everything will be aligned in the middle of the screen, and a padding of 16 dp, so there's a bit room around the edges of the screen. In here we put one opening angle bracket edit text, match parent width, wrap content height. We set the hint to input, and we give it an ID so we can find it later in Java code. Android:ID, add +ID/, edit underscore text underscore input. When we start a service, we can send data to it, and to see how this works, we will type something into this edit text field and send a string to our service. In a real app, this could be a URL, for example. In our case, we will just display the input in our notification. And we create two buttons, one to start the service and one to stop it. Opening angle bracket button, we make it a full width button, match parent width, wrap content height, but it doesn't really matter how you set up this layout. We give it a text, Android:text, start service, and an onClick attribute, so we call a method from here directly, start service in camel case. Now let's just copy this button for our start button and paste it below. We change the text to a stop service and a method to stop service as well. Of course we get these warnings here because we didn't create these methods yet, but we will do this in a moment. And now we create our service class. So again we right click on our package and create a new Java class. Let's call it example service, and it has to extend android.app.service. We don't change anything else and click OK. And in here we get a warning because we have to override one method, onBind. This method is mandatory, but we actually only need this for bound services. Bound services are services where other components can communicate back and forth by binding to it, but our service will be a so-called started service, which means that we don't need this method here and we just keep it like this by returning null. The method we care about is onStart command, because this will be triggered when we start our service. And then we can pass an intent with some information. In our case, this will be the input from our edit text. Now there are two more lifecycle methods that we can override, onCreate and onDestroy. onCreate will be called the first time we create our service. onStart command, on the other hand, will be called every time we call start service on this service. We can actually do this multiple times, and every time pass an intent to it with new information. And every time we do this, onStart command will be triggered, but onCreate only one time in the lifecycle of the service. When our service is stopped, onDestroy will be called, and when we then create a new service, onCreate will be called again. We will keep onCreate and onDestroy empty in this example, and instead we will just take care of onStart command. But before we implement the functionality into this method, let's prepare our main activity, because there we want to send some data to the service and then use it in onStart command. So we switch over into our main activity Java file. First we create a variable for our edit text, private edit text, we call it edit text input. As usual we assign it an onCreate, edit text input equals find view by ID, r.id dot, and the ID we gave it, edit underscore text underscore input. And then we create these two methods that we set as onClick attributes on our two buttons in our layout. They have to be public because we set them in XML, void for the return type. The first one was start service, and it has to take a view, which we give the name view. Otherwise it will crash, because with the onClick attribute it tries to send a view to this method. So it also has to accept it as an argument. And first let's get the input from our edit text. String, we call it input, equals edit text input, get text to a string. Because we want to send this to our service. And to start our service we create an intent, the same as we do when we start an activity. Intent, we call it service intent, equals new intent, then we pass a context for which we pass this, comma, and then we pass the class we want to open, which is our example service.class. To send our input string here to the service, we take this service intent, call .putExtra, then we have to give it a name, which is basically the key, so we can identify it later in our service. and we write input extra as a string. In a real app you should create constants for these keys, but for clarity I will use a hard-coded string in this example. And we pass our input as the value itself. And when we start an activity we call start activity, and when we want to start a service we call start service and pass our service intent. And to stop our service, which we want to do in our public void stop service method, which has to take a viewer v as well, we create the same intent as here, so we copy this, paste it here, and then we simply call stop service and pass the same intent. Okay, nice. And now let's go into our service class, catch this input here, and create our notification. So we go into our example service Java file, and we delete this return statement here because we want to return something else. But first we want to retrieve the string that we sent to this service. Again we call it string input equals. Then we take this intent we get passed here, intent dot get string extra, and then we have to pass the same name as we defined in put extra, which was input extra. But again, in a real app you should use constants for this, so you don't accidentally put typos in here. And then we create our notification. Notification, we call it notification, equals new notification compat dot builder, and here we have to pass a context for which we pass this again, because service is a context as well, and the notification channel ID. And this is what we created this channel ID constant for. We press Alt Enter to import this because this is in our app class. And the notification channel is mandatory for notification on Android Oreo and higher. Otherwise the notification will just not show up. In this case the system will create its own notification which says that our app is running in the background. But of course it's better when we set our own notification. On lower API levels the channel ID will just be ignored. So we can use this method here on lower API levels as well, without anything crashing. And we don't put a semicolon here because now we set the content on our notification. .set content title, here we pass a string for the title, like example service. This will be the title of our notification. We set the text of the notification with set content text, and here we want to pass our input string, just to see that we actually sent a string to our service. In a real app you would use this data to do the necessary background work on it. Next we have to set an icon on this notification. This is mandatory as well. So let's quickly create an icon. For this we go into our res folder here, into drawable, we right click on drawable and create a new vector asset. I'm just gonna keep this Android icon that we already have, but I changed the name a bit to IC_Android, click next and finish. Now back into our code here, .set small icon, and we pass r.drawable.ic_Android. Now we can also do something when we click our notification, and here we want to open our activity when we do this. For this we go above our notification code here, we create an intent that will start our activity, we call it notification intent equals new intent, we pass this as the context, and then the class we want to open, main_activity.class. Now to set this intent on a notification we have to create a pending intent, we call it pending intent equals, then we write pending intent with capital P, dot get activity. Here we have to pass a context as well, this, and I'm going to continue in the next line because it will get a bit longer. We have to pass a request code, which we could later use, for example, to cancel this pending intent. Doesn't really matter here, and we just pass 0. Comma, then we pass our notification intent, which will start our activity, comma, and the flag, for which we pass 0 as well, because the flag just defines what happens when we update this pending intent with a new intent, which we don't do in our example, so we can just pass 0, semicolon. And now we can set this pending intent on our notification, and it will start our main activity when we click on this notification. We do this with set content intent, and we pass our pending intent. And lastly, to create this notification, we call .build, which returns a notification that we save in this notification variable. And when we want to display a notification, normally we call .notify on a notification manager. This is not necessary here because the service does that itself, Instead we call start foreground. We pass an ID that has to be bigger than 0, comma, and the notification itself. The ID is just the identifier for the notification if we later want to update it. And down here we have a warning because we have to return something. Return, and then we return one of 3 values. Start underscore, stickier, not stickier, or redeliver intent. These constants define what happens when the system kills our service. Not sticky means our service will just begun and not started again. Sticky means the system will restart our service as soon as possible, but the intent we pass to it will be a null. Redeliver intent means it will be started again, and it will pass the last intent to it again. Now this played a bigger role for background services because the foreground service is very unlikely to be killed, and here we will just pass start not sticky because we don't care about the service when the system kills it. Semicolon. Now you could also create this notification in onCreate. This way it will only be created one time, even if we call start service multiple times. In our case we recreate a notification every time we call start service, but this makes sense here because we set this input as the message of this notification. So we want to update this when we call start service with a new intent. Okay, before we test this, let's put a comment before start foreground to see what happens when we don't promote the service to the foreground. And we have to register the service in the manifest file. So again, we go into our Android manifest.xml file. And here at the bottom, below this activity closing tag, but inside the application closing tag, we write opening angle bracket service. And we already get the suggestion for the Android colon name .example service. We choose this and close it with a slash and a closing angle bracket. And this is all that is necessary to register the service. Now let's run our app and test it without the notification. Okay, I click start service. We don't see anything. Now I go into the settings, into the developer options, system, developer options. If you can't find the developer options on your device, I have a separate video where I explain how to activate these developer options, which you can also find in the top right corner. And in here we can display the running services. And there's our foreground service example app, which has still a service running, but around the 1 minute mark this will disappear, because the system will kill it. I will skip a few seconds. And it's gone. This is because our service was effectively just a normal background service. And with these execution limits we can't keep it running. So back into our code and into our example service class. We delete this comment here before the start foreground and run our app again. I'm gonna type something in here. Hello world. Click start service. And as you can see, our notification appears. And we can't swipe it off because it's a persistent notification. And now when we go into our running services, we can see it here again. And no matter how long we wait, it will not be killed by the system. I'm gonna skip a few minutes in this video. As you can see, our service is still running, and we can also completely close this activity here, and our service keeps running. I'm gonna skip some more minutes, and as you can see, it's still running. We can also open our activity when we click on this notification, because we set this as a pending intent. When we type in some new text, click start service again, we have our new text here in this notification, but we still have only this one service running, so it didn't start a second one, which means onCreate was only called the first time. We can also stop the service when we click on this stop service button. Our notification disappears and our service is gone from this list here. Now instead of calling stop service from another component, you can also stop the service from the inside. So when you have done your work, you can call stop self, which will stop the service. And you have to stop it, either from the outside or from within, because otherwise it will just keep running. But stop self of course only makes sense after you have done all your work in the background. And stopping the service one time stops the whole service, no matter how often you called start service and how often you triggered on start command. On destroy will be triggered when we stop the service, and the next time we start it again, onCreate will be called. It's also important to note that the normal service does not start a background thread by default. So all the work we do in onStart command runs on the UI thread by default. Which means that if you do some heavy operations in here without creating a separate worker thread and then start your app, the app will not respond. If you want to know how to create a separate thread, I will put a playlist on that into the info card box in the top right corner as well. However, there's also a subclass of service which automatically creates a worker thread. This class is called intent service, and I will make a separate video on that in the future. Here I will just put a comment, do heavy work on a background thread, so you don't forget it when you take a look at the code. And one more thing, let's go back into our main activity again. This start service method here worked because we called it while our app was still opened. If you want to start your service while the app itself is in the background, you should call start foreground service instead. This method tells the system that you want to promote your service to a foreground service as quickly as possible. And after calling this method, you have a time window of 5 seconds to call start foreground in your service class. If you don't do this within these 5 seconds, the system will kill your service immediately. If you try to call start service from the background, it will throw an illegal state exception and your app will crash. Now there are some situations where your app is on a temporary whitelist and you can call start service from the background without a crash, but usually when your app is in the background, you should just use start foreground service. And we get a warning because this method is only available on API level 26. So now we could check which API level we are on and then either call start foreground service or start service. But there is a convenience method which does this check internally, which we get with context_compet.start foreground service. And here we have to pass a context and our service intent. And when we click on this method and press Ctrl B, we can see that it does exactly what I was talking about. It checks if we are on API level 26 or higher, in which case it calls start foreground service, and if not, it just calls start service. So just use this context_compet start foreground service convenience method here. Okay, and now let's see this 5-second window in action. We go into our service class again. And again, I'm gonna put a comment before start foreground. And now let's run our app again. I'm not gonna type anything in and click start service and switch over into our service list here. We can see our service is running, 4, 5, and it's gone. We only have this 5-second window. But when we delete this comment here, it will work as usual. Hello world, start service, there's our service. And it survives the 5-second window. Perfect. Okay, that's how you create a foreground service with a notification. If this video was helpful, please leave a like and don't forget to subscribe for more Android tutorials. Take care.